So we now have the privilege of hearing from Catherine Liddle, CEO of SNAICC, the National Voice for Our Children. Catherine is a Arrernte Luritja woman from Central Australia. She's been a leading advocate in upholding the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on a national, regional and local level. Catherine has held senior management positions in First Nations organisations, including First Nation Media and Yawan Indigenous corporate partnerships, as well as within the Northern Territory Education Department, the ABC and NITV SBS. A distinguished career. A journalist by trade, Catherine's motivation has always been to drive change that leads to positive outcomes and options for First Nations people. As CEO of SNAICC, Catherine works for the fulfilment of the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, in particular to ensure their safety, development and well-being. Such a privilege to have you with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Liddle, who will speak on the topic of stronger actions.
I don't know about you, Mob, but I always find that first bit where people have to go through your bio a little bit uncomfortable. The other thing I find really interesting about rooms like this is I get put up the front, and again, I don't know about you, Mob, but I was always the kid that only got up the front when I was in trouble, which happened a lot. I'm sure that doesn't surprise many of you. Anyhow, a great privilege to be standing here, and as usual, I always begin by acknowledging the traditional lands of the Commonwealth Mob. Thank you. This is beautiful country. And again, one of the first things I do as an Aboriginal person when I land in someone else's country is to go outside and say hello to the ancestors. I got a little bit wet. Got really, really, really wet. Here's the other thing I didn't know, because I'm from, the desert. We don't have salt water, and I was running along the beach, and I was loving it. I was absolutely loving it. I was getting smashed, but the water was hurting my eyes. So I'm like, oh, this must be what salt water feels like. But it was beautiful and something that I really, really enjoy and makes me feel really rigorous and enthused to be here. Obviously, as mentioned, I'm an Arrernte Luritja person, and very, very different country to here. As you head into my country, some of you might be familiar with it. We've got those beautiful McDonald ranges, our caterpillars, and these are really, really significant caterpillars because often those stories of our dream times, people think of them as tokens, and I always think when I hear that name, tokens, I don't think people realise how incredible the stories are that they hold within them, because when you head into Alice Springs and you see our fallen caterpillars, right, there's that place in the middle called the Gap, which is where I'm going to get to. Those caterpillars fell in war, so that is war country, and it's war country because we had permanent water sources, and they stand there as a legacy for the fact that everyone who enters that country should understand we are prepared to die for that country, and it stands as a warning to all. If you come into this country and you behave in a way that is not acceptable, we'll fight you for it. And these are really, really powerful symbols. And again, when you think about things like the language for that country, Arrernte, it matches that country. So the land is a little bit rougher, the sand is a little bit rougher, and when you walk along it crunches. We have the gum trees, and the gum trees, they rustle. These beautiful, beautiful gum trees that cover Luratupa, Todd River, one of the oldest rivers in the world. And those beautiful gum trees, again, I don't know if you've seen them. You might see those beautiful ghost gums that, Albert Namatjira used to paint, my grandfather's first cousin. They are beautiful and white during the day and ghostly, but in the morning, they're orange. They glow orange, and then they turn to silver as the night falls, and you're on your grandfather's country. Luritja, my nana's country, well, that's a little bit different. That happens a little bit further out, and some of you might have heard of Rainbow Valley. That's where the Pradama pick up. And again, it's a softer language, Luritja, and the sand there is more silky. I don't know if you've ever been out towards Uluru and those sorts of places. You can't ever get that red dirt out of your shoes or your clothes ever again. And most disappointingly, that beautiful tan you pick up, it washes off. I never get used to that part of it. But again, those languages, they say so much. Our stories, they say so much. And they're embedded into everything that we do and everything that we see and the way we relate to the world around us. So when we talk about things like closing the gap, for my mob, and I'm sure a lot of you in this room, they don't really understand what that means. In fact, well, our mob, it is actually still living memory when the old people would come into town in full ceremonial gear. So they'd stay behind the caterpillars and send one man in full ceremonial gear, men's business, to ask for entry. Women could not pass through the gap. And they'd go to the old grandfathers and they'd ask to come in. Anyway, we still see it in variations. And when they started talking about closing the gap, but one of the most famous stories in my family is one of those old men came and knocked on the door, not in gear anymore, but he still knocked on the door, and he said to my auntie in mourning, he was mourning, "My daughter, I came to shake your hand because we've been crying for you, mob." And she said, "Uncle, why are you crying for us, mob?" She said, "Because that government is going to close that gap." True story. True story. So that's what I want to talk to you about, because I understand that, it's not only our mob that might not necessarily understand what concepts like closing the gap mean, or more importantly, the new agreement on closing the gap, because that's the space I work on, mean. And again, when we listen to what the Minister was talking about just previously, research, evidence, implementation, co-design, sounds really easy, doesn't it? Oh my God, is it hard? It's one thing to have a lever, it's another thing to have the mechanism to be able to pull it. So SNAICC, of course, is based in children and family. And again, we've been around for more than 42 years, and it was a call from Aboriginal people right across the country to say, listen, we know that in Australia, some of the most heinous policies have been directed at our families and our children in particular, and we need a way to interrupt that. We need a way to start changing policy. We need a way to get our voices into Parliament and to change the programs and to build our evidence base. And we also need things like a Royal Commission into the stolen generations. So that's essentially what happened with SNAICC. They actually had a couple of really big meetings, and one of them actually happened on my homelands out on the telegraph station in Alice Springs. And we've done that ever since, and it's been an incredible journey, that 42 years. We're no longer called the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Childcare, which, when you think about it, at the time, 42 years ago, what a name, the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Childcare. Problem is, no one at that point in time was thinking about acronyms and hashtags. SNAICC. But we are fundamentally proud of that backstory, and we remain SNAICC, the national voice of our children. We're hoping that everyone realises it's like Qantas, but it hasn't caught on. Anyhow, we are the peak body for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander children and families. We advocate to all levels of government about what we know keeps our children, young people and families safe, strong and connected to culture, because all our children and all our families should be able to come into rooms like this and talk about their ancestors and talk about their strengths and be proud of who they are. A large part of our work, of course, is strengthening the layers of supports and services around our children that prevent them from entering out-of-home care or coming into contact with child protection services. So I'm sure this is work you're very, very familiar with. The ongoing impacts of colonisation and racism, they're bloody uncomfortable words, aren't they? Colonisation and racism. I really dislike saying them because they are so awful. But they are real and they are true, and when I say them I like to pause, because sometimes we just need to remember what they mean and how they exist in Australia. We know that it includes intergenerational trauma, and that trauma has been experienced by members of the stolen generations and their families and their communities, and it continues to drive overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children across all stages of the child protection system. And again, I'll pause for a moment, because if you are a member of the stolen generation or a family member of the stolen generation, I understand that sometimes words like this are a bit triggering, so I feel for you. My grandfather was also removed very young, and again, being in Central Australia, didn't go far but we still felt his pain, and he talked about it till the day he died. Colonisation and racism have caused large socio-economic inequities across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous Australians. These disparities include things like employment, education, housing, health, and justice. And again, when we talk about things like employment in communities in Alice Springs and here, I'm sure, in Queensland, when we say there's unemployment, it means there's no jobs. There actually are no jobs because those jobs were decided on by governments, not jobs that were needed in those communities. We know that those socio-economic outcomes contribute to the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families coming into contact with the child protection systems. Now, I'm sure I don't need to remind any of you what those statistics look like because we talk about them all the time, but we do have to say them again. At this point in time in Australia, our children are 10 times more likely to be in out-of-home care than non-Indigenous children. In fact, according to the latest report on government services data, well over 22,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are currently in out-of-home care. The majority of those children will not be reunited with their families or have adequate contact with their families. They won't know their brothers and sisters, their cousins, their aunties, their uncles, their grandparents. Want to know how many people 22,000 is? Anyone been to Alice Springs? That is the entire population of Alice Springs. That's how many of our children are currently in out-of-home care. It is only through Aboriginal community-led solutions that we will see this story change, because what's driving these outcomes is 250 years of colonial policy making and continuing government failure to invest in the well-being of our families and the organisations that support them. Our annual Family Matters report that tracks the trends in out-of-home care and overrepresentation also importantly gives us example of what is working to reduce the numbers of our children going into care. And invariably, it's where our families and communities play a direct role that we see a significant difference. Again, here in Queensland, we heard an example just the other day from Quatsip around a transition of service delivery, and it revolved around a particular child, a child that had been in out-of-home care for 2 years with a non-Indigenous service provider who was working really hard. You know, we've got to pay credit to that. We know people are working hard and we know they're trying hard. But for 2 years, this child, no family contacts, hadn't been able to find a family member. When this case was transitioned to the Aboriginal service provider, within 2 weeks they had 200 familial contacts. Every single one of those familial contacts stepped up and said, I will take this child. 2 weeks. So a lot of what we do is raise awareness about those sorts of things, but also raise awareness of the fact that this and any program is steeped in policy, and that those policies have been created by governments without us. We've heard that already. We've heard that spoken about. And we need to change that. We need to find different ways to strengthen our families and the sectors that support them. The Closing the Gap agreement actually offers a unique point in time in which we can do that. And again, I'm talking about the agreement. That's the bit that says, hey, we can work fundamentally different across employment, health and wellbeing, justice, safety, housing, land and waters, and languages, so that, again, everyone can speak their languages fluently. Wouldn't that be awesome? SNAICC is a member of the Coalition of Peaks, which is a representative body over 70 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled peak organisations and members. So when you think about the size of that, it's quite huge. Each of us has between 200 and 2,000 community organisations behind us. Each of those organisations driven by communities, built by communities, fought for by their elders and their ancestors. It's something we are incredibly proud of. The National Agreement marks the first time that the Closing the Gap outcomes have been developed in genuine partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations, sharing decision-making rather than it being decided for us. What else is different about this refreshed approach to closing the gap is that it's not just about measuring our lives against targets, because those closing the gap targets make us shiver. We don't want to always hear about ourselves in statistics. It's about sharing the decision making. In order to do that, though, we needed to look at things like systemic change. What needed to happen? Well, how do governments work differently? How do you get the research? How do you get the evidence? How do you move towards implementation and evaluation in a way that is genuine? Well, the way we do that is that we work with all of the governments and the services to bring in the aspirations of our communities. And then we look at the key initiatives and we look at ways in which we can hold governments to account, but also our own communities and our own services, because there's a level of that always embedded into these conversations. Everybody needs to be accountable for their actions, and it is fundamentally important when we talk about those actions for children, because the two targets relating to children in early childhood and child protection are getting bigger, not smaller. They're widening. So in amongst those policy levers, which now have 17 new targets, and again, that's because when Aboriginal people were in the room, they said there's something wrong with those targets. And again, a really easy example of that is there was no target for out-of-home care, despite the fact that it was escalating. There wasn't one, it didn't exist. When it came to things like early childhood, the target was enrolments in preschool, and that closed really quickly because what it found was when you actually gave Aboriginal people a preschool to attend, they attended. What it didn't to concentrate on was were there enough early childhood centres, particularly Aboriginal community-controlled childhood centres, that ensured our children had the cultural strengths they needed in order to be able to be successful once they hit preschool. So we know that the disparity between our children and non-Indigenous children continues to grow. In order to do that, we also need to look at the circumstances that our children are born into. From birth, we know that our children are twice as likely to have low birth rates and experience higher rates of child mortality. But even before they're born, they're at risk of pre-birth notifications and infant removals for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies. And again, something the Minister said twigged in my brain around the ability, say for the voice, and I'll get onto the voice a bit later, to bring those voices into the room of executive government. One of those rooms I was in the other day, we brought in, again, a service provider who talked to us about pre-birth notifications. And this example comes from Victoria. And in Victoria, this particular hospital, not in a low socioeconomic environment, makes a notification on every single Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander mother who gives birth in their hospital. That is their policy. These are the things that we deal with today, 2023. In 2021, 21% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children removed in out-of-home care were under the age of 1. This is a growing issue that impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in profound ways. It continues a line of harmful past policies and approaches, especially the stolen generations, and the ongoing removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies at or shortly after birth causes enormous pain and distress. The use of surveillance, control and coercive powers are particularly harrowing. Not only are our children born into circumstances of rampant inequality, they are exposed to a system that was designed to sever their connection to their family and their culture. This is not because we do not love, care or nurture our children. After all, we have 60,000 years of successfully raising children. What's needed now is a proactive and holistic wraparound approach to strengthen the layers of support around a child so that they grow up strong in families and have the best starts and opportunities in life. Under the National Agreement, there are 4 priority reforms that can help us do that. The priority reforms look at the ways government works to achieve the targets, because we know that what is happening now does not work. If we do not fundamentally change it, we're just going to reinforce existing patterns. Priority reform 2 is about building the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled sector. What this means is that governments have actually committed to looking at what's happening and what's doing well, investing in the research and understanding the methodology, and then ensuring that these services have the funding that they need to have to be successful. One of the ways they're looking at doing that is through a project called Stronger ACCOs, Stronger Families. I'm going to assume everyone knows what that is, but just in case, ACCO is the acronym for Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation. You'll hear me use it a lot. So SNAICC was recently engaged by the department, DSS, to undertake part one of this initiative, and that was a research project to look at ways to increase ACCO participation in services funded under the Families and Children activity. And again, I'm sure that's a funding program you know a lot about. Part two of the Stronger ACCOs Families initiative is a trial to build on the strengths of ACCOs and strengthen genuine relationships between ACCOs and non-Indigenous organisations funded under 2 grant programs administered by the DSS, Communities for Children, Facilitating Partners, and of course, HIPPY. An interesting one about that involves the redevelopment of SNAICC's resources, and we weren't the organisation contracted to do that. Anyhow, we got a lot of fundamental reforms to work on. The trial aims to increase the number of partnerships between ACCOs and grants recipients. What we're calling for is a real emphasis on how we change our approach. Recommendation 1, of course, from this particular program relates to community-led decision-making and funding programs and priorities driven by government. We know doesn't work, and the Minister spoke to that just a minute ago. It doesn't work because it doesn't respond to the needs of the community. And again, a South Australian example that we came across recently, it's a community of 4,000 people, more than 45 service providers, and yet the programs that people on the ground were asking for did not exist. Some of those programs were as simple as an after-school program to help children with their study. Really simple. It can only be addressed by government partnering with community and implementing community-led decision-making at every stage of the funding process. So these things include deciding who might deliver those projects and how those projects might be evaluated. We call for DSS to take actions in line with their obligations under the National Agreement and partner with peaks and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to determine funding priorities based on community needs. This includes the design of grant and operational guidelines, outcomes and reporting measures, and grant rules, and guidelines more broadly under the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act. Recommendation 2 looks about the redirecting of funding to ACCOs. Now, of course, this is to remove the barriers that our ACCOs face in competing with non-Indigenous organisations and to overcome the structural and institutional racism and bias that ACCOs have been faced with, and that is put us in the front. Again, some of the work that we've done with education in this space, when we first started looking at some of those programs using the priority reforms, Connected Beginnings, some of you might have heard about that. It was the biggest commitment of the federal government to closing the gap in early childhood development. More than $100 million in this, and yet Aboriginal people hadn't really been involved in it. There's elements of it that are really good, and there are Aboriginal people who work in these programs and other people who work in these programs doing a really good job. But again, what we were hearing is it wasn't really hitting the ground, and it certainly wasn't designed by the communities. So when we talked to the government about that and they said it's doing a really good job, we used the data and we said, tell us how many Aboriginal services are delivering this program. There's 20. There were 2. Using the priority reforms, there are now 17. There'll be 50 within 2 years. So for programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, what we advocate for is that 100% of that funding should actually go to Aboriginal organisations, and to give them first right of refusal or quarantine funds. Then, partnership or subcontracting models with non-Indigenous providers should be considered only where partnership is ACCO-led and consistent with genuine partnership principles. And secondly, where transitioning planning to the ACCO is included in the funding agreements with clear timelines. Where ACCOs can only partially meet funding requirements, DSS and other agencies should consider options that will allow for the funding allocation to be made with the provision of additional resources and scaffolding required to ACCOs so that they can work towards meeting requirements within a reasonable timeframe. And again, some of that scaffolding, when you start unpicking grant agreements, might say that an ACCO can't apply for a particular project if they haven't had 10 years of experience delivering $10 million projects. You need time to be able to get to that point. Or you need to change the guidelines. Recommendation 3 for investment in the growth and development of ACCOs. So this means that ACCOs need to be competitive in the procurement processes, and that means they need their core operations adequately resourced so that there's actually someone around to be able to write that grant. So you're not just on the floor, you're just not on the front line trying to squeeze in a grant application at 6 o'clock at night because you've only just walked off work. We know that we've seen decades of underfunding and historical exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from access to assets that have created significant disadvantage for our ACCOs in competitive funding processes. We argue that DSS should help develop and implement funding models for ACCOs that recognise the historical exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations from access to assets, and adequately allocate a proportion of total funding that can be used to support the core operational needs of ACCOs. Recommendation 4, of course, is about reducing the administrative burden on organisations across the system. This one I can give you a personal example on. We are a relatively small peak, getting bigger. I did sign 3 employment contracts last week, so that's a good thing. But I think we sit at currently about 55 employees, and I have 49 different funding agreements. And we're a peak body, we're not a frontline service delivery. DSS can alleviate some of this by improving and streamlining processes and requirements, resourcing ACCOs to grow their capacity to navigate and meet administrative requirements. DSS should also invest in ACCO-led program evaluation by working with the peaks and the communities on the implementation of service and program evaluations. And that includes being able to make decisions about who is doing the evaluation and what the framework is. Number 5 relates to the disadvantage that ACCOs have faced in procurement processes, where they're often considered, historically they've been considered to have a conflict of interest when in actual fact they were experts. So we need a way to ensure that those voices are in those rooms. It's been an ongoing challenge for funding activities that include evidence-based practice requirements. Recommendation 6 relates to building the government's capacity to work better with the ACCO sector. That's an ongoing issue and one we're happy to be in the room with. Someone asked me the other day, do you ever get angry? I get angry all the time, but it gets me nowhere. Understanding how to channel that and use that as energy and go back to the table again, that helps me a lot. Consultation with our participants repeatedly said that they had raised the same issues and concerns in previous consultations and directly with governments, but nothing had changed. Hence why we get a little bit angry. Increasing funding to ACCOs needs to be driven from within all departments and at all levels of government through a concerted and sustained effort to identify and remove institutional and systemic barriers. But I think if I sort of round up to where I started and where we are in Australia today, I think fundamentally everything I've said shouldn't be new to any of you in the room, and I don't think it is. Certainly isn't new to any of our community-controlled services, because these are things that we've been saying for a very long time, but we've never been able to get our voice through until this point in time. So we have those priority reforms, shared decision-making, and we know we're at the table moving those things, but it's still not quite enough, because these systems were designed without us. And if you want to be really, really honest about it, they weren't only designed without us, they were designed specifically to exclude us and to override our own ways of doing things. It was done deliberately. It's no wonder it doesn't work for us. So we know that even though we've got the National Partnership Agreement on closing the gap, in the past month we have seen laws proposed federally and in the Northern Territory, again without us. I have been in the room with ministers and heads of government in the Northern Territory just really recently where they told us we will not be doing co-design on our response to Alice Springs, but we might have an advisory group. And again, if you want to look at what direct policy failure looks like, take a look at what's happening in my hometown. Our children are the future. Indigenous communities are no different. But what kind of future do they have when our children continue to be taken away? When our children continue to end up in youth justice systems and the gap in early education continues to widen? We all need to put our foot to the accelerator on this. We need a bit of fire, right? We need a little bit of fire under government. We need a little bit of fire under all levels of government. We can have a bold minister, but we need everyone to be firing. We need to stop the status quo, because the status quo just isn't working. When we've talked to our board and our council about where we stand at this moment in time, again, I like standing up the back, and what they said is SNAICC has to be bold and it has to be brave. Because how can you call yourself the voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and advocate? Everything you do is about changing the voice, ensuring that our voice is in programs, in services, in policy, if you don't stand up and back this in. So right now, we know, because this is what we do all day, every day, work on policy. It will be hit and miss if governments listen. If Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory had an effective voice, the truth of it is we wouldn't be seeing the problems that we're seeing in Alice Springs right now. It is the direct impact of years of policy failure, a failure to resource our remote communities and to listen to our aspirations and our solutions. Like I said, while government doesn't pay for the jobs out on those communities, there's many, many jobs on those communities. They're just not the ones that governments pay for. We need to be working together to create a better future for our children. Now, I know that many of the organisations in this room back the call for a voice, and I know that sometimes it's uncomfortable to do it because I can tell you as an Aboriginal person, it's not 100% comfortable because these things are scary. And I appreciate that it's not easy, but as I said, my board said stand up and be brave and be bold, even though all I want to do is sit up the back. We know from long experience what happens when we stick our necks out, which is why we like to sit up the back. But this is too important an issue for us to stay back and for me to sit up the back. So I'm going to leave you with SNAICC's position on the voice to consider and maybe spark some important conversations. Despite all our work, all our efforts and passion, our children are still being removed. They lag in school readiness and those gaps are widening. We need to remember that these are not our failures. We need to fire the ambitions of all governments, services and leaders to work with us toward a better future for our children and our nation. A voice will light that fire, fueling the work that we do, driving the change that has to happen. The journey towards the referendum is an opportunity for truth-telling so that we can say words like racism, like colonisation, and be comfortable about saying ugly words like that. We need to be telling the truth right now to understand why so many of our children end up in out-of-home care, never to return to their families. The journey towards the referendum is that opportunity for truth-telling, for respectful discussions and debates. They won't be comfortable, but they should be respectful. We respect, of course, that there will be differing views and opinions, and that's okay. You're allowed to have a different opinion. But SNAICC's position is clear, and that is that our children deserve no less than yes. Thank you.
So we do have time for a couple of questions. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question on the floor? Maybe I will start with a question then. Clearly there's a mix of people in the room. There are Aboriginal people and there are people from a wide range of organisations. What's the most important thing we can do to support SNAICC moving forward at this point?
Look, I think the thing with SNAICC is, we're the peak body, so really what we're doing is we consolidate the voice of the organisations and the communities behind them. So I think it is, I think the easiest thing to do is take a look at the Closing the Gap agreement and see what the priority reforms are and start looking at how you might apply them to your own ways of working, and start moving from the grassroots up, because we can push up here, but if it's not firing from the bottom as well, it fails. So having a look at that agreement and start thinking about how you embed those aspirations in your own everyday business is a really good start. If you're working with families, it's about listening to what they're actually saying. We hear that a lot. And again, a really simple example, because people often don't really understand what that might mean, but we hear a lot about how poverty is often mixed up with neglect, how families, particularly those families that are heightened, might have heightened anxiety for a whole heap of reasons, might seem like they're overreacting when in actual fact they're distressed. And again, these things become notifications and people consider them to be difficult. One of those examples again, we heard one in South Australia about a child that was removed. And grandma went in and she was absolutely devastated because one of their other children that had been removed had a very sad outcome. And she went in to fight for this child, and as a result of being angry and distressed, she was banned from being able to go into that office again. And then she tried to get to another office, which was 5 hours away, only to be told that she couldn't come into that office for support because she hadn't had a referral from the one that she'd been into. So you can imagine what happened then. So it's really about listening and understanding distress in a different way. Again, another really simple example that I'd heard recently was a family member who said, she was really, really struggling, and the caseworker was trying to work with her, but the person doing the investigation on this one said, listen, you need to change your parenting practice. What do you reckon that means? What do you reckon that means? So understand that language really, really matters. Going to bed early might be one of those ways. Getting up early might be one of those ways. But changing your parenting practice is a whole other story. So look at different examples in the way that you communicate, and talk to your Aboriginal peers as well. Don't lean on them for everything, because we get a little bit tired. I'm going to tell you, we get a little bit tired. But certainly watch and learn, and if in doubt, ask an Aboriginal community member or an Aboriginal manager for help. But it starts with trying, even little things. And I know how hard it is to say our names. So I often hear Arante and Lurcha said slightly different, said more like that, other than Aranta or Lurja. But you know what? Thank you for saying it. Thank you for trying. That's really important.
Are there any questions? There's a question over here.
Thank you for that. Brian McDowell from Family Life in Victoria. I guess as an observer as we see service provision coming across to Aboriginal organisations more, it's a wonderful thing to see. I guess I was just wondering if you've got any observations or what's happening in terms of equipping the organisations to be strong to deliver. Because what I worry about is that will enable finger pointing of going, see, they can't do it when they're not properly equipped, and it's frustrating. So.
Absolutely. And actually we hear that again at all layers of the conversations that we have, that when transfer starts to happen, rather than looking at what the relationship is or what the existing resources are, if it becomes difficult, very, very quickly the discussion becomes, oh, they weren't ready for it. Oh, they can't really do it, without accepting that perhaps actually you just needed to move a little bit differently. One of the things, again, in that Stronger ACCOs report was that when organisations are looking at transfer of service delivery, it is underestimated how much work it is for the Aboriginal organisation to take that on, because we're actually bringing you on that journey, and the cultural load and the cultural work required to bring an organisation on that journey is significantly higher. The lean-in is on us. So when they were looking at the estimation of hours involved in that, it was completely unbalanced. So there are those sorts of things. We have heard even comments where organisations are saying, listen, this is all too hard, it's not going to work. How about what we do is increase the number of Aboriginal people in our services and that will do it? No, it won't. No, it won't. That will not fundamentally change the way your organisations work. It can improve them, and where there are Aboriginal people working in mainstream organisations or NGOs, that's awesome. We're really proud of all of those mob. But it is not the same. It is absolutely not the same as a service that is designed for Aboriginal people.
Hi, Catherine. Anne Hollands, National Children's Commissioner. Congratulations on your presentation this morning. Fabulous. I could really feel the fire in the room that you were trying to light, so well done. I really just wanted to acknowledge you and SNAICC for the great work that you've been doing in the last few years, particularly. Great Stronger ACCOs report. I mean, I love reading your publications because they're so well credentialed and so rigorous, but also so powerful. And I just wanted to say, as someone who's been around the traps for a while, and like many in the room, has been very frustrated with the slowness of change. Are you feeling more optimistic now? Are you seeing some key levers shifting sufficiently? Or do you still lie awake at night thinking, oh my God, when is this going to happen?
I don't only lay awake at night, I sometimes have a panic attack. But when I have those moments, I do, as you say, reflect on how much has changed so quickly. So and my brain also goes, when we move too fast, we also see problems. And again, when we see knee-jerk issues responded to again, and again, that's one of the reasons SNAICC advocates very strongly for voice, because when governments respond to a political spike, it is usually with a knee-jerk reaction. So, for example, and again, if I use the Queensland example of the announcement of a new detention centre, millions and millions of dollars, understanding that what sparked that was very deeply distressing for all communities. But you look at it and you go, well, that's going to pay for the building of the centre. That's what those dollars are spent on. Does it actually strengthen the community and stop these issues arising in the first place? No, they don't. But which one's going to get you elected? So that's what we deal with in Indigenous affairs all the time. All the time. So I do lay awake at night. That is true, but I am seeing hope. I know the Minister referred to Safe and Supported, the first time Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people partnered on that plan, and the very first two sentences when you open Safe and Supported were actually drafted by the Aboriginal leadership group. So from the moment you open it, you see it. When you talk about things like voice in policy, well, what does that actually mean in practice? You might not necessarily go, oh, that's my voice right there. But what you do see are the levers for things like community-designed programs. Communities able to not only design their programs, but then to choose who it should be that delivers those programs. These are significant changes, all of them pilot, but you got to start somewhere. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Really has shone through your passion and commitment for better outcomes for Aboriginal children and families. It's obviously something deeply on your heart, keeps you awake at night. Hope you can get some better sleep because better things happen, and really thankful for your time today. Thank you so much for